Se están conectando. Buenos días. Vamos a dar inicio a esta conferencia. Agradecemos la presencia de los estudiantes, invitados especiales y nuestras autoridades académicas por asistir a esta inauguración de nuestro tercer coloquio de posgrados del Instituto de Ingeniería y Tecnología. En esta mañana saludamos a quienes nos acompañan aquí de manera presencial en este recinto y a quienes están conectados a través de Microsoft Teams en línea. Bueno, vamos a dar la bienvenida a nuestro presidium. Nos acompaña el doctor Eric Sánchez Flores, coordinador de posgrados de la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez. Le damos una bienvenida al doctor. También damos la bienvenida a la doctora Giselle de la Cruz Hermida, coordinadora de investigación de esta universidad también. Sí, a la doctora Marisela Soto Padilla como representante del Departamento de Ingeniería Civil y Ambiental. Al doctor Juan Luis Hernández Arellano, representante del Departamento de Ingeniería Eléctrica y Computación. Y a la doctora Vianey Torres Argüelles, representante del Departamento de Ingeniería Industrial y Manufactura. Su servidora, Nelly Gordillo Castillo, coordinadora de investigación y posgrado de este instituto. Voy a dirigir este evento. También queremos dar una cordial bienvenida a nuestro invitado especial, el doctor Alex Mayer. Le cedo la palabra al doctor Eric Sánchez Flores para que nos dé un mensaje de bienvenida.
Bien, muchas gracias, muy buenos días. Agradezco a nombre de la doctora Beatriz Díaz Torres, coordinadora general de investigación y posgrado de la UACJ. Les saludo con agrado y agradezco esta invitación de la doctora Nelly Gordillo, coordinadora de apoyo al desarrollo de la investigación y posgrado en IT, quien pues amablemente nos ha compartido para estar esta mañana con ustedes. Saludo también y agradezco pues al director del IT, el doctor Juan Francisco Hernández, y a los jefes de departamento y coordinadores de programa que nos acompañan. Muy buenos días a todos. A nuestro invitado, el doctor Alex Mayer, bienvenido también. Para la coordinación de posgrado es motivo de gran orgullo lo que ha venido ocurriendo en el Instituto de Ingeniería a lo largo de estas 3 ediciones. Si me permiten, voy a quitarme un poco para que se entienda mejor. A lo largo de estas 3 ediciones del Coloquio de Posgrados. El trabajo de investigación que ustedes llevan a cabo y presentan en eventos como este, no solo permite enriquecer el diálogo y la comunicación entre las diferentes áreas de la ingeniería, sino que al mismo tiempo refleja en buena medida un panorama nacional en el que el conocimiento que se genera en las diversas áreas de la ingeniería ha contribuido cada vez más al avance y consolidación de las diferentes áreas clave para el desarrollo del país, como la producción, la tecnología, las comunicaciones, la infraestructura, la salud y el uso de los recursos naturales en un marco de sustentabilidad. Ejemplo de ello es la conferencia que estaremos escuchando el día de hoy por parte de nuestro invitado especial. En un famoso artículo de la revista Forbes, según datos del Foro Económico Mundial del 2015, México se encontraba entre los 10 países con mayor número de estudiantes de ingeniería en el mundo, con más de 113,000 estudiantes en aquel momento, e incluso por arriba de países como Francia. Hoy se forman en México alrededor de 1 millón de estudiantes de ingeniería en las diversas áreas del conocimiento. De acuerdo con cifras de la Encuesta Nacional de Ocupación y Empleo, al tercer trimestre de 2021, en el país había más de 1.400.000 profesionistas ocupados en las áreas de la ingeniería. Cabe destacar que 77% de ellos son hombres y 23% mujeres solamente. De los más de 35,000 investigadores reconocidos en el Sistema Nacional de Investigadores en México, el 14%, alrededor de 4,900 investigadores, desarrollan su trabajo, su labor de investigación en alguna de las áreas de ingeniería. Sin embargo, y esto es algo que debe destacarse, de los 312 investigadores en el SNI que pertenecen al SNI en la UACJ, el 26%, 83 de ellos se encuentran adscritos a este instituto, al Instituto de Ingeniería. En términos proporcionales, esto representa una gran diferencia y habla del nivel de consolidación que ha ido adquiriendo la investigación en esta rama, en Ciudad Juárez y en especial en nuestra institución. De los 2,400 programas en el Sistema Nacional de Posgrado, 503 se especializan en la formación de sus estudiantes en las áreas de la ingeniería. Esto representa casi el 21%. De la misma forma, de los 44 programas que la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez tiene reconocidos en el Sistema Nacional de Posgrado, pues prácticamente 11 de estos programas, el 25%, se encuentran dentro de este instituto. Dicho sea de paso, 92% de nuestros programas en toda la institución están reconocidos dentro de este sistema y pues de ellos 11 de estos programas pertenecen a ingeniería. Aunque estas cifras de alguna manera reflejan el creciente interés por la formación en ingeniería y específicamente por la formación a nivel de posgrado, es necesario ampliar y extender aún más el impacto de la formación y la investigación en estas áreas para contribuir con mayor efectividad a la solución de problemas nacionales De ahí la importancia que tiene este tipo de ejercicios, este coloquio de investigación de estudiantes de posgrado en Ingeniería, para, pues desde aquí, justamente por la labor que ustedes llevan a cabo en las aulas y en los laboratorios, contribuir con los resultados de sus investigaciones al avance del conocimiento y a acrecentar el impacto positivo que este tiene en el desarrollo. Por eso los felicito ampliamente por su participación en este coloquio, a quienes se encuentran presentes esta mañana aquí y a quienes también están conectados siguiendo este evento a través de Teams. Y bueno, pues quiero aprovechar y hablando de precisamente participaciones positivas, quiero hacer un par de comerciales. Primero, invitarlos anticipadamente a que estén pendientes de la convocatoria del Coloquio Institucional de Posgrado 2022, que se llevará a cabo en noviembre. También queremos invitarles a todos ustedes, quienes están participando hoy en este Coloquio de Ingeniería, a que se sumen también a la participación del Coloquio Institucional. En este evento tendrán ustedes la oportunidad de presentar sus avances de investigación frente a la comunidad académica de posgrado de toda la institución. Es un ejercicio muy interesante porque permite justamente el diálogo interdisciplinar, permite conocer qué se está haciendo en nuestras áreas y qué áreas de vinculación, qué áreas de oportunidad tenemos para colaborar también con otros institutos. El ejercicio ha sido muy interesante en sus 2 ediciones anteriores. En 2022 se llevará a cabo la tercera edición igual que aquí, así que invitarlos cordialmente a este evento. Además, el próximo 10 de junio se estará llevando a cabo en la UACJ como parte de una convocatoria del Consejo Mexicano de Estudios de Posgrado en México, el concurso institucional 3MT. Este es un concurso en el que los estudiantes de posgrado tienen la oportunidad de presentar sus resultados y avances de investigación en un formato de tipo pitch de 3 minutos con una sola lámina ante una audiencia no especializada. Hay un jurado que calificará cada una de las presentaciones con base en el impacto, en la comunicación de los resultados y en el impacto que estos tienen para pues, el desarrollo de los diferentes sectores de la sociedad. No será una presentación ante un comité académico, será una presentación ante un comité de gente que proviene de los diferentes sectores de la sociedad, así que también es un ejercicio muy interesante que además de afinar sus capacidades de comunicación, del conocimiento de los resultados que llevan a cabo ustedes en investigación, les dará la oportunidad de medir hasta dónde está siendo percibido el impacto de su trabajo, qué tanto resulta importante para la gente lo que ustedes están haciendo aquí en la universidad. Invitarlos también a que participen. La convocatoria está abierta en este momento para que se registren a través de la sección de convocatorias en el portal web de la universidad. Entonces, pues con eso quisiera yo reiterar mi felicitación, desearles el mayor de los éxitos en este trabajo que llevan a cabo dentro del tercer coloquio de posgrados de IT. Muchas gracias por su invitación y enhorabuena por el trabajo.
Muchas gracias, doctor Sánchez, por este mensaje de bienvenida. Les pido se pongan de pie un momentito para dar paso a la inauguración de este evento. Sí, siendo las 10:46, el día 26 de mayo de 2022, damos inicio de las actividades del tercer coloquio de posgrados del Instituto de Ingeniería y Tecnología. Felicitaciones a todos los participantes y ponentes. Pueden tomar asiento. Para continuar con este evento, le pido a nuestro presidio si gusta pasar aquí a la primera fila para dar paso a nuestro ponente. Quisiera presentar ante ustedes al doctor Alex Mayer. Él es profesor de Ingeniería Civil y director ejecutivo del Centro de Gestión de Recursos Ambientales de la Universidad de Texas en El Paso. La enseñanza y la investigación del doctor Mayer se centran en encontrar soluciones a los problemas de los recursos hídricos mediante el modelado de cuencas hidrográficas y acuíferos subterráneos y mediante interacciones con las partes interesadas del agua. Sus temas de investigación actuales incluyen el modelado de sistemas de recursos hídricos, pagos por programas de servicios ecosistémicos, impactos del aumento del nivel del mar en los acuíferos de aguas subterráneas costeras, acceso al agua en ciudades de desierto y poblaciones desatendidas, e impactos del cambio climático de la disponibilidad del agua urbana y agrícola. Es un honor para nosotros como institución dar la bienvenida al doctor Alex Mayer. Welcome, doctor Alex Mayer. También agradecemos al doctor Alfredo Granados por la invitación y de nuestro invitado especial. Cedemos la palabra al doctor para que presente su conferencia. Un aplauso, por favor.
Muchas gracias por la amable introducción. Me siento muy honrado de haber sido invitado a hablar en este importante evento. Siempre es emocionante ser parte de una convocatoria y nuevamente me siento honrado de que me pidan que participe en ella. Desearía que mi español fuera lo suficientemente bueno para poder dar mi charla en español, pero me temo que todavía tengo mucho que aprender. Gracias. Así que voy a hablar en inglés, disculpen. Sin embargo, como verá, el texto de las diapositivas está en español, así que espero que pueda seguirme. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about a research project that we've conducted about how to solve a binational problem of scarcity of water. And this has to do with the sustainability of the Valle de Juárez-Hueco Bolsón aquifer. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, especially Dr. Granados Olivas, who's been a great colleague and has been a very important part of the work that I'm going to talk to you about today. And also other co-authors, Dr. Bill Hargrove, recently retired from UTEP, Joe Heyman at UTEP, and then Matthew Sanderson at Kansas State University. So the outline of my talk, first I want to give some background to the research, and then I'm going to talk about the current conditions and then expected future conditions about water resources in the region. And the region I'm talking about today, I'll show you on a map in a moment, but it's about the Paso del Norte region, which I'm sure all of you are aware is experiencing and has experienced for quite a while water scarcity. And then the main focus of the talk is on something called serious games, which we used this method of serious games to see if we could resolve a binational problem of scarcity in water. And I'm going to tell you about the motivation for choosing to work with serious games, the design of the serious games process, and then I'll stop with the results. So the broader project, that the specific topic that I'm going to talk to you about today was a 5-year project, actually 6-year project, funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And again, Dr. Granados is a very important collaborator in this project. And the central question that we were trying to address is how can we manage water in this region so that the competitors for water in the region can achieve a sustainable future. And our general approach to this was to use modeling to try to predict current and future water availability, but also to engage with stakeholders by evaluating future scenarios of how to manage and new technology innovations and policy innovations that might help us to solve this difficult problem. So this is a map of the study area. So this is the general location here, and then this is the blow up of the map. And what is pointed out on this map are the different water supply sources for the water users in the region. And the water users in the region include the cities of Ciudad Juárez, El Paso, and Las Cruces. Those are the main cities. And also then within this binational region, we have several irrigation districts that use water for growing various crops. And the water that's used then for the urban and agricultural uses comes from the Rio Grande, which runs more or less like this. There's a major reservoir, the Elephant Butte Reservoir here in New Mexico, where water is stored for use by both states of the United States, New Mexico and Texas, and then also by Juarez or Chihuahua. So that reservoir again stores water for that use. But it's important to realize that most of the water actually comes from up here in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. So most of the water that we use in the Rio Grande in this region is actually coming from snowmelt that originates in the high mountains of Colorado and New Mexico. And one reason why that's important is these high mountain snowpack-driven water supply systems are very vulnerable to climate change and climate variability. And this is true of many of the snow-fed basins in the southwest of the United States. And I can discuss, if you want, at the end of the talk, some of the reasons why there's so much vulnerability to climate change for the water here. So the water sources, again, the Rio Grande, with the water stored in Alpha Butte Reservoir, and then there are two major aquifers that are also used, the Mesilla-Conejos Medanos Aquifer and the Hueco Bolsón Valle de Juárez Aquifer, which is going to be the main focus of my talk today. So the river water is shared by both countries and also by multiple states. And also you can see that the groundwater aquifers, both of them, are also shared by multiple countries, both the United States and Mexico. And both of these aquifers also are characterized by the fact that the pumping from the aquifers is much, much greater than the recharge. And so what that means essentially is that the water in these aquifers is being mined or depleted every day, every year or so. And also another thing to point out here is with both the river water and the groundwater, the water is used conjunctively, and what that means is that typically if a water user has access to the river water, they will use that first because it's relatively inexpensive. But if there's scarcity of the river water, they will use groundwater. So it's a highly interactive, complex system with the river water and the groundwater connected in the way I just described. Also, again, involving two states, the United States, who don't get along very well sometimes, and also two countries. And so in this region, I think probably all of you are aware of this, that the water supplies for urban agricultural uses are already stretched thin. And this is because the region faces a growing demand for water and less reliability of supply. When I say less reliability, the Rio Grande water the availability of Rio Grande water has been severely compromised over about the last 20 years or so, with less and less water. And also because the groundwater aquifers are being pumped and the pumping is greater than the recharge, those aquifers are essentially being depleted. And we know from looking at history going back more than 1,000 years by using tree ring data that the mega drought that we're currently in with regard to the Rio Grande is just about tied for the worst mega drought in about the last 1,200 years or so. And if we have one more bad year, not that this is something to be proud of, it will be the worst mega drought, with a mega drought being more than 10 to 15 years than we've experienced in more than the last 1,000 years or so. As far as governance, the allocation of the river water or the surface water is reasonably well detailed or spelled out in the compact in the United States between the US states and then the treaty between US and Mexico. So the governance of the river water is reasonably stable. However, the governance of the groundwater is almost non-existent. That is, there are no rules or policies, explicit rules or policies that tell us how we should manage these transboundary aquifers. So to provide some more background, let's look at the present situation. And so what you see in this in the pie charts here are the different sources of water that are being used by Ciudad Juárez and by El Paso. And we're going to focus primarily on these two cities here and their use of the water from the Hueco Bolsón Valle de Juárez aquifer. And again, in the pie charts, then we can see that Juárez, most of the water comes from the Hueco Bolsón Valle de Juárez aquifer, with a smaller portion from the Conejos de Medanos. In El Paso, the mixture of water supplies is somewhat more mixed, or somewhat more diverse, with Rio Grande water, water from the Hueco Bolsón, the Coneo de Medanos, but also desalination of saline water or brackish water from the Hueco Bolsón aquifer. There's more water used by Juárez in total than El Paso, which is what you would expect given the large difference in population. But you may not be aware of the large difference in the per capita use of water between the two cities. So the per capita use in El Paso is roughly twice that in Juárez for various reasons, and that can make for some interesting discussions. And then over here in this table, then I've detailed or given all of the uses of water from the Hueco Bolsón by both cities, and then there's a small amount used by agriculture and by industry in addition to that. So the numbers may not mean much to you right now, but they will become important when we do some fairly simple calculations a little bit later. So I mentioned that that we're in a 20-year drought with regard to the Rio Grande, or at least the upper part of it. And in this plot, we're showing storage in Elephant Butte Reservoir, which is our main water storage reservoir, from the beginning, from when the dam was first built, all the way to about the present. And so you can see this 20-year period here, where year after year, we're getting very little water from the Rio Grande. That's and this again, this 20-year, we're now about 22-year low supply of water is about to unfortunately become a record. And in these pictures down here, you can see the big difference between having a full reservoir, such as what we saw in this earlier period here, versus having reservoirs that are almost empty, as we've seen over the last 20 years or so. And this lack of availability of Rio Grande water, at least in the U.S. side with the irrigation districts, for example, this year, the Elephant Butte Irrigation District is only going to receive about 1/20th of their usual allocation of water. And so that means farmers are going to have to be making adjustments. So now to get back to the Hueco Bolsón aquifer, which is again the main focus of the talk here, and a very important component of the water supply for both El Paso and Juárez. What we've seen over the last several decades or so is that groundwater levels have dropped, and the decreases in groundwater elevations since the 1960s has been on the order of 35 meters. And then about 35 meters from 1903 to 1996. At that point, El Paso reduced its pumping from the Hueco Bolsón, and so the reduction in groundwater elevations has been slowed somewhat, but still 20 meters over the last 50 years or so. So the amount of water is a concern, and this depletion and reduction of groundwater elevations. But you also may know that in the Hueco Bolsón Valle de Juárez aquifer, we have both fresh water and brackish water. And when I say brackish water, that usually corresponds to concentrations of total dissolved solids of at least 1,000 milligrams per liter or gram per liter. Over that level, it becomes very difficult to use for drinking water. So that 1,000 level is pretty important. And so we see concentrations within the aquifer on both sides of the border that are a couple times to a few times greater than that level that we call brackish water. And both cities, excuse me, have experienced salinity on both sides of the border, experience increased salinity due to pumping of the fresh water, which is causing the lowering of pressure in the freshwater portions of the aquifer, is causing brackish water to move from other parts of the aquifer towards those wells. And El Paso Water, or the city of El Paso, actually has built a desalination plant, has been operating for at least a decade now, to treat the brackish water or desalinate it to levels that are permissible to drink. So if we look at increases in salinity, I've just chosen numbers from one well here, but we see that increases in salinity have been as much as 30 milligrams per year. Now to do a little bit of arithmetic, what I want to do here in this slide is to determine the rate of depletion of at least the freshwater portion of the Hueco Bolsón Valle de Juárez aquifer. And so we know from literature, from the various studies that have been published, from looking at data on pumping, that the total pumping by both cities is approximately 232 million cubic meters per year. And the recharge to the aquifer is only on the order of about 40 million cubic meters per year. So as I've already mentioned, the pumping greatly exceeds the recharge, and that has to mean then that the aquifer is being depleted, and the difference between those numbers gives us that depletion rate. The recharge numbers are so-so. Some people say that they could be higher. Some people say that they could be lower, but I think no matter what estimate you would use, you'd see that the recharge rate is very small compared to the pumping rate. Then another number we use is what currently is the available amount of fresh water in the aquifer. That's a very difficult number to establish, but we've drawn from the literature and we think that the best number here is about 8 billion cubic meters per year. So here comes the really tricky math. I know you can all do division. If we take the amount of fresh water remaining and we divide that by the depletion rate, we have an estimate of how long the fresh water will last, and we get here about 40 years. Now that doesn't mean that anybody's going to run out of water, because both cities have multiple sources of water. However, it does mean that our water, I think, on both sides of the border is going to become more expensive. And also we could argue about whether this is really a sustainable practice to essentially drive the aquifer so that there's no longer any fresh water present. So now we're going to look at the future. And so what we're doing here is we're trying to estimate how long the water will last out into the next 50 years or so. And the numbers I presented in the previous slide, that's for current conditions, current water use rates, current populations. But we know that population increases are going to occur in both cities, most likely much more in Ciudad Juárez, given recent population increases, and to some extent less of an increase in Ciudad Juárez. But we're talking about 66% increase in population in Juárez as predicted by the water utility there. And 35%, that's still a large increase in population in El Paso. Now we're assuming for now that the per capita use, that's the per person use, will remain relatively constant. So on the El Paso side, there are some predictions that say that the per capita use may decrease somewhat, but in El Paso there have been somewhat substantial reduces in the per person use over the last 10 or 20 years or so. And it's not clear whether there's a will for people to continue to reduce. And then in Juárez, the per capita use is half of that of El Paso. And I know very little about water use in Juárez, but I would suspect it might be very difficult to reduce that per capita number in Juárez since it's so low to begin with. And so we assume then that as the population increases, the pumping from the Hueco Bolsón will have to increase at that same rate of increase in the population. Another part of our project has involved looking at future climate change and its impact on water availability from the river, from the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. And we think that on average that the water availability from the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo will decrease, will be reduced even more by about 30% each year on average. So if we put all this together, it means that the pumping from the Hueco Bolsón will not only continue to deplete the aquifer, but will actually increase. And some of this is also going to be affected by warmer temperatures that we expect to occur in the region due to climate change. So that will increase water demand both in the cities and also from irrigation from agriculture. It's also possible that the recharge will decrease because at least on the El Paso side, some of the, or a large portion of the recharge has come from leaky irrigation canals. Because many of the canals are not lined with concrete or anything like that. And the irrigation districts are on this campaign of lining the canals now because they know that the water is going to become more and more scarce. So that will save water for the irrigators, but it will reduce the recharge to the Hueco Bolsón. And that illustrates the complexity of these systems. You can think you're doing a good thing by lining the canals, which is a good thing. That's a good water conservation practice. But because we've gotten used to having recharge from those leaky canals, that's going to have an effect on the sustainability of the Hueco Bolsón aquifer. So taking all of these items here into account, we think that the pumping rates will increase to almost 300 million cubic meters per year. And if we go through the same math that I did on the previous slide, where we subtract off the recharge, which actually, again, may decrease. I haven't accounted for that here, but that 41 number may go down. We start with the same amount of available fresh water. And because the pumping rates are expected to increase over the next decades or so, now we're looking at just about 30 years of lifetime for the recoverable fresh water, which I think is pretty alarming. So that presents the background. And then managing groundwater is always difficult, and much more difficult typically than river water because we can't see it. Sometimes we have very little measurements, and the policies that have been developed for sustainably managing groundwater are far behind those for managing river water. And then in our case here, we have, again, managing groundwater is difficult even if that groundwater aquifer is completely contained within one state or one country. But now we have this fragmented governance because the Hueco Bolsón is again shared by two countries. And so, and we've known about this for decades, right? We've known that that the aquifer is being depleted, and yet there's been very little movement to try to figure out how to manage the groundwater aquifer better. So what we propose to do then, as one way to explore binational cooperation, is to use what are called serious games. And a serious game, it's not that fancy really. It just means that we have an exercise that engages the participants, in this case stakeholders of the Hueco Bolsón aquifer, in solving a hypothetical but realistic problem with the intention of, in this case, finding potential ways of collaborating between the two countries to manage the aquifer. And so another way to think about this is it's a simulated decision process. So our idea here was, again, to put the stakeholders on both sides of the border together, discuss the problem, and see what binational measures of cooperation could come from this. And again, I think it's maybe fairly clear that an aquifer, and in this case, is a common pool resource. But by that I mean what you do on one side of the border in terms of pumping or recharge affects what's going on the other side of the border. So our proposal is that because there has been cooperation between the two countries in the past, at least with surface water, is we can build on that cooperation to solve this challenging problem. And so what we did again is we engaged with stakeholders from both sides of the border to explore binational solutions to this transboundary aquifer problem using serious games. So the serious game workshop was held over 2020 to 2021 over a 12-week period over Zoom. This was in the middle of the pandemic and with simultaneous translation. We invited participants from municipal, industrial, and government sectors. The number of participants in any one session was between 13 and 20. And every session typically had about the same number of participants from both sides of the border. And we focused primarily on the main users of the aquifer, which are the cities of El Paso and Ciudad Juárez. And we presented the current and future scenarios that I already showed you in my previous slides here, and discuss whether and how to extend the life of the depletion of the Hueco Bolsón. And we presented the same kind of model that I showed you today to determine depletion rates and the time to depletion, to complete depletion. We reviewed the structure of the model. There's much more detail of the structure of the model from which those numbers I've shown you have come from, but I don't want to spend time talking about that today. So we assume, and we looked at the assumptions of the models and what they were predicting over time. And we asked people whether they had confidence in the model or not. So there are 4 questions that we wanted the participants to address. And so the first was, how long do we, if at all, do we want to extend the lifetime of fresh water in the Hueco Bolsón Valle de Juárez aquifer? Everybody who participated agreed on the need to reduce the depletion rate, but we wanted to find out by how much. And then now we come to some of the more difficult political problems. How much should each side reduce their pumping? If we agree that we have to reduce the depletion rate, that's got to come from reducing the pumping, but how much should each city reduce? And currently, Ciudad Juárez pumps 67% more than El Paso, although in the past, El Paso pumped much more than Juárez until the difference in population in the 2 cities got to be where the population in Juárez was driving that there was more pumping from the Hueco Bolsón than in El Paso. And so one of the choices we looked at is, if we're going to come up with a solution, should it be based on just maybe a couple of different schemes? One would be to reduce the same absolute amount on either side of the border, which would have less impact on Ciudad Juárez because Ciudad Juárez is pumping more. Or should the formula be based on equal percentages, which would have more of an impact on Ciudad Juárez, again, because Ciudad Juárez is currently pumping more. And of course, you might imagine all sorts of other formulas you could come up with. Should this be based on current pumping rates? Should it be based on historical pumping rates? There are very, very few places in the world where there have been agreements like this developed to manage transboundary aquifer. And the only one that I know of that's really successful is for an aquifer that's shared between Switzerland and France, the Genovese aquifer. And they have a very simple formula there where each country is allowed to pump the same amounts from the aquifer, and there's a cap on that amount that's reviewed every few years or so. So that's the only place, again, in the world where we've seen anything close to a successful agreement of this kind. And then so if we are going to reduce pumping, that water has to be made up for somehow. And is that going to come from finding additional supplies or reducing demand? And the options that we looked at were to expand desalination over what already occurs in El Paso, aquifer recharge with treated wastewater, direct wastewater reuse with direct potable reuse, imported water from farther away, incentivize water conservation, especially for outdoor water use, and then repairing infrastructure leaks. And so we looked at all of those options for each cities. And then the last question, again, another difficult question here, is since the Hueco Bolsón is a common resource to both cities, and because it's a common pool resource, actions on either side of the border affects the other side of the border. Thank you. Thank you very much. Who should pay? So all of these options that I mentioned here under question 3, they cost a lot of money. Even conservation can cost money. So who pays, and what should that formula look like? Another very difficult question to resolve. So we looked at many, many different options, but in the end came up with 7 basic options that then were eventually voted on by the workshop participants. And those options included do nothing or business as usual, that is continue pumping at the same rate. And then a few other options here then that are listed here more or less in increasing order of increases or decreases in pumping. So 2 and 3 here involve either an equal percentage reduction or equal absolute reduction. 4 and 5 similar, but with greater amounts of reduction. And then 6 and 7 similar amounts to 4 and 5, but also concurrently, not just making up the reduced pumping with additional supplies, but reducing the demand, in this case, either equal percentages of 13% or 44 million cubic meters per year. These numbers may seem kind of odd. We did most of our work in acre feet, in thousands of acre feet, which were much nicer or even numbers. But again, we looked at across many possible numbers here. The participants experimented with a spreadsheet where they could look at different rates of reduction of pumping and then see the corresponding increase in the water supply, increase in the depletion rate, or sorry, decrease in the depletion rate. They could also choose different measures and see the cost of those different measures. And so again, for each of these options, then we were able to calculate the lifetime of the freshwater in the aquifer and the costs associated with the measures for replacing any kind of reduction in pumping. So these, in this bar chart here, I have all 7 of those possible options. And again, more or less increasing in the amount of water being the reduction in the pumping, except down here we have do nothing. So again, these are those same 6 options for reducing pumping and reducing water, in some cases, reducing water demand. And then these, what we're showing here are the costs in US dollars, in millions of US dollars, split up between Juarez and the costs associated for Juarez and El Paso. So here we calculated how much it would cost Juarez to have additional water supplies to overcome the reduction in pumping or for water conservation. And we calculated then that separately from for El Paso. This is not meant to imply who should pay what. It just shows the amount of money that it would take, and according to our estimates, to overcome the reduction in pumping. And then the red numbers here are the aquifer lifetime. So if you remember, the future scenario that I presented earlier predicted a aquifer lifetime or freshwater lifetime of 31 years. And then, of course, as we decrease the pumping, those numbers go up. So a 15% reduction by both, and or a 25 million cubic meter per year reduction by both would increase the lifetime slightly, but we have to go to much larger reductions in pumping to get to 50 years, and then even larger reductions to get to something approaching 70 years. So what we were actively discussing in these workshops is how long should it last? And that's a very difficult question. I think if I were to ask you, how long should it last? There would probably be a range of numbers here. We had people who said it should last forever, which would essentially mean cutting back the pumping to the level of the recharge. And we had some people saying, this is a natural resource that we can exploit. We'll always come up with other sources, so we shouldn't reduce the pumping at all. Actually, that opinion I didn't say that correctly. Some people were saying very small reductions, preferred very small reductions, such as these here. So I want to just pause and ask if there are any questions about what I've said so far, including this chart here. Okay, hopefully that means I'm clear. Yes.
When you say water from, what options can be identified for importing water into this region?
For Ciudad Juárez, continuing to pump water from the Conejos de Madanos. And then I believe there's also an option of looking to the mine, but I don't remember the name of it.
We have the 2048 hydrologic plan that state government built, and they have other options around these mines and the other options around.
Okay. And then in El Paso, the idea would be to import water from Del City, which is, I think, 90 miles from El Paso. And it is extremely costly. It's very, very costly. It's the most expensive water that El Paso will have by far, and the project is on its way. Importing groundwater is expensive for several reasons. One is that there can be very high legal fees because this, in El Paso's case, this is water that's going to be, that's in an agricultural area. So you have to get permission from the farmers that are there that you can pump their water in quotes. So the legal fees are very high. And then you have to purchase the right of way to build a pipeline. Then you have to build a pipeline. Then you have to pump the water, which uses a lot of electricity. And then also in the case of Del City, the water is brackish, so it will have to be treated. So this will be water that will be about 10 times more expensive than Hueco Bolsón water. So these are very expensive alternatives, but it's sort of been the history, I think, of cities in the South, in this region, to just reach farther and farther and farther away. And another project we're working on is looking at least at El Paso, is that how much will these numbers affect water rates? And so we're concerned that in El Paso, at least, that some people may in the future be paying 5%, 10% of their income simply for municipal water. And that's much, much larger than what people are paying now because of these new expensive sources. Yes. Adrian.
Hi, Alex. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative. I want to ask you something, perhaps derived from all these discussions. Are we ready for the feds to take charge? Do we want to have a federal regulation for underground water now? Is it still, I know this is a subject that most people don't want to talk about it because, the less involvement we have from higher authority, the best. But right now, even to try to implement some of the results from this study are hard to do without the legal framework that make it compulsory to move into that direction. And even to justify additional investment, you really need to have some sort of international agreement that says, this is going to be the limits that we're going to be allowed to pump out. Right now is like land of nobody, right? Actually it's underground water that nobody regulates, the same way they regulate surface water. So in your opinion, are we ready for a federal international regulation of underground water?
I think it's a very good question. And I will mention, I do have a few more slides that will get at some of this, but we do have institutions, the U.S. International Boundary Waters Commission, and then on the Mexico side, the equivalent institution, SILA, and their job is to manage binational water. And their attention has always been on the river water, and this covers the entire U.S.-Mexico border, so that would include everything from San Diego, Tijuana, to the Colorado River Basin, to the Rio Grande, and of course to the Rio Grande. And that would be the likely institution to step in and create some kind of binational framework. I think they're kind of scared to do that. I think partly because at some point, I think you have to talk about numbers that are going to be like a cap or a limit on pumping, and that's very unpopular on both sides of the border. And so I think that will make it slow. I know that at least in the U.S. side that there are people working towards policy about binational management of groundwater. It might take a crisis to do it. This is what I call a slow-moving crisis. Not that slow, 30 years. But it might be that one country or another starts to exploit an aquifer that hasn't been exploited yet, and thereby sort of putting their claim on that water. And I think that might be what does it, because that'll be an incident, right? This is, again, just a slow-moving thing, right? That is existential. But I think when you have something where one country or another starts to exploit another binational aquifer that hasn't been exploited before, I think that's where that conflict, I guess, unfortunately, might push us that way. However, other people would argue that, once you get the national governments involved, it blows up. It now means it's going to take 30 years or something like that. We do have some difficulties in that on the U.S. side, the groundwater is managed by states. So Texas, New Mexico, whereas on the Mexican side, it's managed by the federal government, and that mismatch can make it sort of difficult. So I think it will come, but I think it's going to take at least 10 years. Oh yeah, I now remember what I was going to say. Because the national governments can make it so contentious. People, I think, on both sides of the border maybe don't like to be ruled by the national government, and so maybe it means local to local agreements. So El Paso Water and the Junta Municipal Agua y Saneamiento, if we can get them together, and maybe you guys could help, at least on the Mexican side, they could come up with a local agreement. And ultimately, of course, I think on the Mexican side, I think you can't avoid but bring in Conagua. But if perhaps this could start by just the two cities talking to each other, you could avoid some of that, junk crap that happens when you bring in the national government. Okay, so at the end of the workshops, then what we saw is, again, everybody said something should be done, and that the rate of depletion should be reduced, and thereby increasing the lifetime of the aquifer. And remember, what we're doing in these workshops is there's a bit of a back and forth. There will be proposals for reducing the pumping, and then the participants would look at the cost. And they would say, well, maybe not, maybe we need to reduce that. And so there was this iteration going back and forth. And so the range of proposed pumping reductions, the smallest is 33%, and the largest basically 100%. And there was also discussion on whether an equal volume or an equal percentage approach for reducing the pumping was appropriate. And the sorts of ranges that were talked about was, in general, more of a reduction of pumping on the Juárez side, because the pumping rates are substantially higher, at least now, than on the U.S. side. So in the end, the most popular option was an equal amount reduction of 50 million cubic meters per year for both countries. That will have a greater impact on El Paso than Juárez, right? Because an absolute reduction compared to a percentage reduction means more of an impact on the city that's doing less of the pumping. And all this together then would mean a 38% reduction in pumping, which would give a lifetime of 50 years. And the measures to replace that pumping included encouraging conservation, but also adding new, more expensive supplies, including desalination for both countries. There have been discussions about a desalination plant that would serve both countries, or even a desalination plant in Juárez that might pump water to deliver some of the water to El Paso. Outdoor conservation also was discussed, especially in El Paso, as I mentioned. Conservation of water used outdoors, as I mentioned. The per capita use in El Paso is about twice that in Juárez. That's most likely due, or much of that is due to a difference in outdoor watering, with much more outdoor watering occurring in El Paso. Reducing leaks. The leakage rate in the percentage of leaked water in the water distribution system in Juarez is substantially higher than at El Paso, so that would make more sense for Juarez. However, that's very expensive too. Reducing leaks in the distribution system is very, very expensive. It's also politically unpopular because it means that your streets are shut down for months and months at a time. And then also long distance importation for both cities was discussed, which again is very expensive. So the takeaway messages are then again, there was significant convergence on the goal to extend the life of the aquifer, at least the freshwater part. The participants expressed confidence in the model results, which included our prediction that under current conditions or future conditions, the aquifer could be depleted in about 30 years. Participants thought that was believable, and none of them wanted to accept that option of only 30 years. There was agreement that this is a binational issue and that binational cooperation is essential. And there are small improvements that are being made on each side. For example, in Juarez, the leakage is being reduced, as I understand, by reducing pressure in some parts of the in the distribution system. El Paso has plans to do more aquifer recharge, but these are all fairly small improvements, and they're not really going to change the trajectory of depleting the fresh water in just a few decades or so. And just to repeat again, this is a common pool resource. The participants agreed with that, and again noted that what's done on one side of the aquifer does affect the other side. So in the end, there was no final decision, especially about how to divide up the costs. That was too hot. That was too the participants. I wouldn't say they avoided that, but that was difficult for them to approach. But there was agreement that this won't be fixed overnight. But all the participants said we should continue these discussions and make sure that this really is a binational discussion. But the challenge is turning the goals that were established in this workshop into reality. And finally, I would summarize that there was a sense of mutual engagement, that people wanted to continue with this process and they were committed to it. And there was a consensus that binational action is absolutely critical and is necessary. So next steps, I'll just leave that as a question now, and maybe some of you have some comments about what might be some appropriate next steps. And that's my last slide. So any questions or comments? I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you for your attention. If you don't mind translating. Gracias.
Muy bien. Mi pregunta es, ¿por qué? Bueno, yo tengo entendido que desde hace 20 años ya sabía que los mantos acuíferos se estaban consumiendo muy rápidamente.
My understanding is that we already know that for more than 20 years that the aquifers are depleting.
¿Por qué hasta ahora estamos haciendo algo entre los dos países?
Why is it that we're just barely doing something in between both countries?
I think some of the Adrian's question before gets at that I think both countries are scared to commit themselves to the reality that pumping has to be reduced. I mean, nobody likes to do that. So I would say it's a lot of it is political will that hasn't been there. And again, we're not the only two countries that have struggled with this. There are binational aquifers all around the world, and it's been very difficult. Again, there's only one case that I know of where this has has been achieved. I think also, to me, this is a little bit like climate change, that it's a slow moving, well, not so slow again, when you consider just 30 years, but it's a fairly slow moving thing. You don't see it. It's difficult to get people engaged in that process. And then the big water users, they don't want to be the first ones to say, they're not going to volunteer and say that they're going to reduce their water. One of the issues with common pool resources is, unfortunately, you sometimes get the case where somebody will volunteer to reduce their use of that resource, and the other people will say, thank you very much, we'll continue to use it at the same amount. But there have been cases where those common pool resources have been taken. But I think it's political will. It is a crisis, but it's not a crisis that everybody sees every day, right? Again, I think maybe the issue of binational management, I think maybe it'll be pushed when there's a real international incident, again, where one country is pumping water from a binational aquifer and is not informing the other country. I hope that doesn't happen, but that could unfortunately push it to where real action is taken. And it means sacrifice, right? It means money. It means sacrifice from individuals, right? I mean, you're the ones who are going to pay through your water rates, I think, to solve this problem. And then also on the El Paso side. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you very much for the participation, Doctor. It's a quite honor to have you here at the UA, this university. Well, my question is, I'm coming from Chihuahua City, which is the capital city of the state. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that I think the situation with water, it's been critical, right, recently. But the thing is that I think it's not, well, of course, the efforts could be part from the government, but, well, I try to see beyond maybe also us as people, as users of this water. Mm-hmm. And, well, the previous question was about why until now, right? But maybe other right question could be, what are we doing, right now and today, right? We as people using water. But, well, my question is, well, you talked about these interesting efforts from government and from organizations, which is pretty interesting. It's awesome. But maybe I try to see the other side of the coin. Maybe if we try to see the demand, well, not only the offering, right, but the demand. I mean, trying to maybe some efforts about saving water, maybe, or some campaigns or something, because I think it's a responsibility from everybody, right? And I see your effort and your great job, and I feel like shocked because it's great what you're doing, but maybe we should try to do something. We as users, I feel that responsibility. You talked to me about this, and I really feel the responsibility because I want to do something as well. So what will be your advice for everybody to do something else for the water and for other generations?
I think there is room to conserve water probably on both sides of the border, but I think as populations increase and the effects of climate change on at least the river water increase, it would be very difficult to conserve enough to completely overcome that. And I also struggle with this issue. When I look at these numbers of per capita use on both sides of the border, and in one city it's twice that of the other, it seems difficult for myself to point to you guys and say you should conserve more when it apparently looks like, for whatever reason, cultural, historical, etc., there's just less water use here. I think there is room for reduced outdoor water use in El Paso. And The best way to do that is to increase the price. It's either increase the price or offer incentives. And the price is going to increase. That's inevitable. The price in El Paso has been increasing somewhere between 5 to 8% per year. And if you take that rate, you're talking about the rates doubling within maybe somewhere between 10 and 20 years. And the response from consumers, especially with outdoor water use, is they will reduce the water use if the price increases. So in El Paso, that might occur, not necessarily because anybody's doing it on purpose, but just because the price is going to increase that much. I also think what a citizen can do too is to go to, it's really boring. I've been to these meetings of like the water utility meetings where citizens can speak. You have to sit through a lot of stuff about contracts and this and that. And I don't know if there's an equivalent sort of opportunity here, but go to the water utility meetings and make your concerns known that if you feel this way, that depleting a resource like this isn't acceptable. Maybe they'll hear that too. But I really appreciate your comments and your question.
Thanks so
And
much.
it's my honor to be here. So thank you.
Buenos días a todos. No sé si me haga favor de traducir, compañero. En todos los pronósticos que vi, nos dan tiempos de 50 años, 31 años.
In all your estimates, you give us 31 something years.
No hay bueno, ¿qué se tendría que hacer? No solamente para tener agua.
What should we do just not to have water, but
sino para que los mantos acuíferos se empezaran a rehabilitar, incluso con lluvias.
So groundwater aquifers can rehabilitate, including rainfall.
Yes, I mean, I don't want any of the things that I've said here to imply that either city will run out of water. First of all, because both cities' water utilities will find the water, and populations are going to be increasing in both cities, and again, both will somehow, I think, find the water, but it's going to be much more expensive. If we do reduce the pumping, then I don't think we're ever going to reduce the pumping to the point to where the aquifers will recover. I think we're just talking about whether it's a rate of depletion that looks like this or like that. And hopefully I'm not being too pessimistic or cynical here, but I just think that's what we're going to see unless there's a real change of political will. And so I'm sorry to be pessimistic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alice, for the conference. This is not a question, but I'd like to listen to your opinion. In the last weeks, I have seen some Facebook and Twitter publication about the water consumption by the industry, in contrast with the water consumption by people. For example, Monterrey has a critical problem right now with water, but in Monterrey there is a Coca-Cola factory and a beer factory. What is your opinion about the water consumption by the industry in contrast with the water consumption by the people? Is it real that the industry is the water consumption is extremely higher than in contrast with the people?
I think in both cities it's a relatively small part of the use compared to residential use. However, talking about crisis, there could be a point to where I don't know if industries will leave because they're concerned about the future of water, but maybe industries that might consider moving to this region may look at this and say this is not sustainable. So that, you know, I mean, business sometimes can bail us out, right? If both cities are seeing that their tax money is going to go down or whatever, their employment's going to go down or not go up as quickly as they'd want because new industries are not going to come. I don't know if we've seen that in the world in general, in the southwest of the United States or the northwest of Mexico yet, because you look at, for example, Arizona, new industries and pretty heavy water using industries are still moving there. And Arizona, in terms of surface water and groundwater, has very similar conditions to this. So it hasn't happened yet, I think, where an industry has decided not to come because they're concerned about that very important part of their supply chain. But I think it could happen in the future.
Thank you.
We have two questions from our audience online. The first question is, does the Elephant Butte Dam affect to both cities' water resources? The Elephant Dam.
I didn't quite understand the question.
The question was if this dam affects to both cities' water resources.
If the what?
The dam, the elephant, la presa.
Yes, yes, it does. Yes. Elephant Butte stores water that is allocated to Texas, New Mexico, and Juarez, and not the city of Juarez. Almost all of the water that comes from Elephant Butte goes towards irrigation in either New Mexico, Texas, or the Valle de Juárez in the case of Chihuahua. I don't know if that's going to go on forever. This is another kind of controversial thing, is whether the water rights held, for example, by the Valle de Juárez would eventually be transferred to the city of Ciudad Juárez. But definitely, yeah, the amount of water in the Elephant Butte Reservoir is important for both cities.
Thank you. We have another question. How can we replenish aquifers for both countries with mega projects?
I guess the projects I can think of are aquifer recharge projects. So for example, there is some aquifer recharge there's quite a bit in Juarez right now.
We have the dam all around the Sierra de Juárez, and that's one of the purposes that they are rehabilitating those.
Okay. And in El Paso, there are engineered artificial recharge systems where treated wastewater is spread over the land surface such that water infiltrates into the groundwater. They're fairly small efforts. And so mega project, it would take a mega project to make a big difference. It would take hundreds of millions of dollars probably to build large enough aquifer recharge facilities to make a big difference. So they're expensive because you need to treat the water to a pretty high degree, higher than usually wastewater is treated if it's going to be disposed of in a river or used for irrigation, because if the aquifer is being used for drinking water, the wastewater has to be treated to a very high level to avoid contamination problems. So that's expensive. And then the aquifer recharge facility itself is somewhat expensive, but it is gaining more and more acceptance, I think, in the southwest of the United States, and I think to some extent in northwest Mexico. But it would take a mega project to make a difference.
Thank you. And we have a final question. What is the ratio of industry consumption and population?
Is this again referring to like how much water industry uses?
Yes.
I don't remember the percentages off the top of my head. Do you remember for Juarez by any chance? 10%? Yeah. My understanding is that many of the maquiladoras, and I might be completely wrong here, is they are using, well, first of all, they're not big water users, not like a Coca-Cola, right? They don't use that much water in their industrial processing. And I think many of them have built their facilities so that they are fairly low water using in the first place. The industrial processes are low water using, and then they have built in some conservation methods. And then on the US side, it's about, I think, the same percentage in terms of industrial water use. I wouldn't necessarily say that the industries on the US side are necessarily water conserving. We do have our El Paso Electric, depends on groundwater or to a little bit of extent surface water. It's likely that they'll be using even more water in the future from groundwater because they'll be needing to provide more electricity to El Paso as the population increases. And then also as temperatures increase, which unfortunately they will, we don't know how much, the cooling needs, which depends on water use, will increase. But in general, these two cities have fairly low industrial water use. I would also say on the El Paso side there's been some encouragement for residences to use less water over the last couple of decades, but not so much with industry or commercial use. And that's their next. El Paso Water is going to concentrate on conservation in those sectors in the next several years.
I might want to add that function on the industry because of the
Exactly. And thank you for bringing that up because, we were talking about what's going to cause the change. Maybe, for example, if people are having to spend money, time, the employees are having to spend so much money and time with dealing with water. If that causes problems with employment or something like that with the maquiladoras, then maybe the maquiladora, the industries will say, hey, something has to happen because it's affecting our workers. I don't know if that would be the case, but it's another possible, I think another possible way that we could start to face the problem. Yes, exactly. If there's not enough water, or it's, again, I don't think it's about running out of water. It's about the cost. If the cost goes up enough, exactly, it's going to be, if the profit isn't there, then they'll go elsewhere. Or again, it might be industries that could locate on either side of the border may choose not to because they're too concerned. Again, maybe not so much about running out of water, but the cost.
Thank you. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
your presentation.
Thank
Thank you for the answers to your questions and for being in this event today. And queremos dar un fuerte aplauso a nuestro ponente.
Muchas gracias.
Agradecemos al doctor por la presentación y vamos a finalizar este evento. Sí, un comentario final.
I have a question for you. So first of all, thank you for the participation, and it was very informative. And also, well, my question is that to you, what do you consider that is the most important factor on this part? Because as we know, it's a multidisciplinary topic.
Yeah.
But we know that we have to be to decide which one is the most important part of it. So if it is like the economical part or the aquifer by itself. So which one do you consider that it has to be the most important part of by taking the decision? So in your decision, what do you have to consider the most to decide?
If I understand the question correctly, I would say it's not a technology problem. I mean, maybe partly because desalination, wastewater reuse, those are fairly expensive processes, and every year they get a little bit less expensive because of improvements in technology. But overall, I'd say it's not so much a technology problem. It's a political problem. That again, it's complex politically because you have multiple countries. And not to keep repeating myself, but countries and states don't like to impose limits on water use. And again, the surface water, the riverside, it's of things, it's somewhat less complex because we have water rights, right? There are numbers. Okay, in the US, we call them water rights, and on the Mexican side, they're concessions. And whether those are enforced or not, who knows? But there are numbers, right? But groundwater, we don't have those numbers yet. We don't have numbers that would say overall in one country that this is the cap on pumping that has to occur in the future. And I think in Northwest Mexico or Northern Mexico, there have been some gains in governance where there have been agencies that have stepped in and said we do need to reduce the pumping rates, or we can't allow new wells to be installed to be put in. On the U.S., we're all watching. On the U.S. side, we're all watching California because they have a policy that's a few years old now, where they're saying every groundwater aquifer in the state, except the binational ones, need to come up with some sort of limit on pumping. And they're supposed to be doing this within just a few years. Most of the aquifers have missed that deadline because it's turned so political. It's again, nobody wants to be the first person to make that move. So again, it's a political problem.
Okay, so since it's a political problem, so what do you think that it could be the best decision for the aquifer? To like stop pumping and stop recharge it, or if it's
I think just I don't want to be quoted to say stop pumping. And I'll tell you just a short story. My very first professional visit to Mexico was in Hermosillo, and they have some problems too with managing groundwater. And I gave a talk about it, and a reporter asked me a question that I didn't quite understand, and I answered it. Well, they should stop pumping, and it was a headline the next day in the newspaper. So anyway, I think there do have to be reductions in pumping. And I think also we have to look at using wastewater to recharge the aquifer. But I am pretty sure that it's not going to be about balancing the pumping in the aquifer. It's just, is it going to last 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years? The freshwater part. And again, I'll repeat again that I don't think we're going to run out of water. It's just going to get very expensive. Maybe to the point where it might affect industry, and I'm actually concerned about people with lower incomes on both sides of the border, is that what they're going to pay for municipal water is going to start to be as expensive, approaching electric bills and things like that. And so we do need to consider that now. We need to make sure we protect the most vulnerable by our water rates. So for example, making sure that there is always a certain amount of water that's very cheap so that everybody can afford it. Now, making water cheap does not encourage conservation, right? But I think it's the most vulnerable of our households on both sides of the border. They're not the issue, right? They're not the ones that are using substantial amounts of water per household. So I think water rates that push the amount of water, increasing water rates will push the amount of water use down, but we need to be careful that we always have this amount for a minimum amount of water that is very cheap for all of our citizens.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your talk. It's been a pleasure for us to have you here this morning. Vamos a dar un aplauso al doctor para terminar esta sesión.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Y les invitamos a continuar con las actividades del coloquio. Muchas gracias. Vamos a finalizar.